Good day. Today I will be focusing principally on the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Moscow and the various other meetings that have taken place between the Chinese and the Russians over the course of that visit. But before I do that, I am going to again revert to that perennial topic of discussion on this channel, which is the situation in Ukraine and what is going on the battlefields. And this morning, I found reports all over the British media about a drone attack on a Crimean town, which supposedly had destroyed a railway train carrying calibre missiles. And this report, this claim that the Ukrainians had carried out this successful attack on this train carrying those missiles, was, as is so often the case, reported in the British media without real qualification. If you drill down, you will see that this is based purely on Ukrainian claims, but credence is given to it, and the headlines give the impression that it is confirmed. Well, there was a Ukrainian drone attack on a town in Crimea, but the Russians claim that it was unsuccessful. I am going to here go to Slavyangrad, which have an account of what happened. This is, of course, a Russian account, but as I've said on many occasions, I've consistently found Slavyangrad to be a reliable channel, and one, by the way, which frequently and sometimes very harshly criticizes the Russian authorities in the way that they conduct the war. So it's certainly not, despite what some people claim, a vehicle for Kremlin propaganda or anything like that. Anyway, this is Slavyangrad's account of what happened over the course of this drone attack. And I'm just going to read it out, and I'm just going to make a few comments afterwards. About Ukrainian raid on Jankoy. Jankoy is the town in Crimea where this attack happened. Tonight, another massive strike by Ukrainian drones was carried out on the Crimean Peninsula. At least 6 drones of the Mugin 5 type. I believe they're made in China, by the way, but I might be wrong about that, equipped with explosives, were used against Jankoy. As a result, 2 drones were shot down by the Panzer air defense missile system, and 2 fell on administrative buildings near the railway station. A 5th destroyed a grocery store, whilst shrapnel from a 6th damaged private houses on Yuzhnaya Gagarin and Chekhov streets. And then there's a map, there's a reference rather to a map which shows the approximate area of destructions. And then the account then goes on to say, initially, information was received that the Ukrainian formations launched drones from Shkolny airfield near Odessa to strike at a Russian military airfield. However, judging by the area of application of the drones, an attempt was made to hit a railway station building and the railway track. Jankoy is the main transit hub of the Russian military group in Crimea. Railway lines to Sevastopol and mainland Russia pass through this railway station, and an attempt to strike at the railway station looks logical. Despite statements from Ukraine that a train with calibre cruise missiles was hit as a result of this attack, this is not so. In the event of the destruction of such a train with weapons, at least a secondary detonation would be visible, and there is no sign of such an explosion. In addition, when launching drones over long distances, the Ukrainian armed forces, as a rule, fill in the coordinates in advance to increase the noise immunity of the electronic warfare systems of the drones. It is extremely, to increase the noise immunity of Russia's electronic warfare equipment. In other words, you let the drones operate over a long period of time by remote control. You try to avoid providing instructions to the drone over the course of this journey, because it could be presumably detected by radio interception devices and can then be jammed. And the article finishes, it is extremely difficult to hit a moving train in this way, something which I would have thought was obviously true. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of details about this account, but it seems to me that on this occasion at least, as indeed on many others, the Slavyangrad report is the more reliable one. There was a Ukrainian attack. It did appear to target the railway lines passing through this town, Jankoy. It doesn't seem to have succeeded. Russian officials are saying that railway traffic continues as normal. A certain amount of damage to buildings nearby was caused. Apparently there have been civilian casualties, but the Russians deny that a train with Kalibr missiles was destroyed. And unless I see some more authoritative confirmation of this, for example, satellite photos, I'm going to assume that that was the case, that there was no destruction of any such train. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this incident. It's an interesting incident. It shows that Ukraine continues to launch strikes against Crimea with drones, despite the fact that that article in the New York Times about 10 days ago, which floated for the first time claims that the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines was carried out by a pro-Ukrainian group, despite the fact that that article said that US officials were highly critical of these kind of drone attacks, including the drone attack that Ukraine launched against the Saki airbase in Crimea in August. Well, despite those claims from the New York Times that the United States disapproves of these drone attacks on Crimea, well, Ukraine is paying no attention and is persisting with them. So there we go. Now, moving aside, what has been going on the battlefronts? And I suspect because Russian news channels have been dominated by reports about Xi Jinping's visit to Russia, which is indeed a huge event, there's been a lot less information about what has been going on the battlefields. And I would say the same is true to some extent from the Ukrainians as well. But anyway, there's clearly been continuing intense fighting going on in Bakhmut. And the reports suggest that the Russians are continuing to make progress inside the town. In fact, a Russian commentator, I call him Russian, though I believe he's actually by origin Ukrainian, but anyway, he's reports from Russia and is clearly on the Russian side of this war. Anyway, a Russian commentator, I'm going to call him a Russian commentator, Yuri Podolyaka, has suggested that, in fact, there's been an intensification of the fighting in and around Bakhmut, with the Russians pressing very hard, and that the Russians were actually trying to clear Bakhmut of Ukrainian troops. During Xi Jinping's visit, the idea being that, if Bakhmut were under Russian control, by the time Xi Jinping came to Moscow, or if it fell under Russian control over the course of Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, that would in some way enhance Russian prestige and strengthen Russia's position in terms of the negotiations that are going on between the Chinese and the Russians in Moscow. I'm going to say straight away that I think this is completely wrong. I very, very much doubt that the Russians are following any such political timetable in terms of their operations in Bakhmut. Now, having said that, as I say, it's difficult to get a clear picture of what is going on there, but it does seem as if the Russians are continuing to make headway in Bakhmut itself, and also that the northern pincer of their forces does seem to be approaching now definitely Khromovo and these other villages in the north, just to the north of Khromovo. And here perhaps I should say, and correct a mistake that I made in my previous video, the village in the north that they're trying to capture, which I've referred to is in the past as Orekhovo Ivanivka, is actually Orekhovo Vasilyevka. My apologies to everybody for that error, and my thanks to everybody who's pointed out that correction. But anyway, the fact is that the Russians seem to be pressing hard in order to capture that particular village. There's apparently been a heavy shelling by the Ukrainians to try to slow down the Russian advance on this particular village. And there's more reports that the Russians are making further progress within Bakhmut itself. Now, the Daily Telegraph and some Ukrainian channels reported a Ukrainian counterattack against the southern pincer, an attack which supposedly has pushed the Russians back from the road, and it's apparently happened around Ivanivska, as I said. I am perfectly willing to believe that such counterattacks, such local counterattacks do take place. I remember a couple of days ago, there were reports of a similar Ukrainian counterattack along the northern road, the one that passes through Khromovo. Well, that counterattack was then reversed, and the Russians are apparently now poised to capture Khromovo. And there's obviously a lot of ebb and flow in the fighting in Ivanivska, in Khromovo, in Bakhmut itself. But the overall picture is that the Russians continuing to make progress. Now, this brings me back to this tantalizing question of the Ukrainian counterattack, or the predicted Ukrainian counterattack, to try to relieve Bakhmut. Now, earlier today, I saw a report from a Ukrainian channel, from memory, I think it's called Resident, which said that the Ukrainians, in fact, far from planning a counterattack in Bakhmut, are now gradually coming to acknowledge that Bakhmut is lost. But anyway, Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, has, on the contrary, apparently warned that a Ukrainian counterattack is a real possibility. And he's done that in a letter, a public letter, which he sent to the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. And this is how TASS reports the story. Russian forces control about 70% of Artyomovsk, Bakhmut, but Ukrainian forces are preparing a wide-scale offensive. Wagner PMC founder Yevgeny Prigozhin said in his letter to Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, published on Prigozhin's press office Telegram channel on Monday. Currently, Wagner PMC units control about 70% of the settlement Bakhmut and continue their offensive until total liberation, Prigozhin said. According to available information, in late March, early April, the enemy plans to begin a wide-scale offensive and inflict flank-cutting losses in order to cut off the Wagner PMC from the remaining Russian armed forces, the letter notes. In this regard, Prigozhin asked Shoigu to take all the necessary measures to prevent the separation of the Wagner forces from the bulk of the Russian armed forces, because such a separation would lead to negative consequences for the special military operation. So that's what Prigozhin has said in a letter to Shoigu. Now, this may very well be true, and I'm not saying that it's not. In fact, I've already said that, in my opinion, I think it is highly likely that Ukraine will try to launch some kind of a counterattack over the next couple of days to try to reverse or at least relieve the pressure in Bakhmut. I noticed that the Daily Telegraph, in that same article in which it said that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back some distance from the road that passes through Ivanivska, that the Daily Telegraph was saying that the Ukrainians believe that if they can hold on in Bakhmut for a further month, then the prospects will start to brighten for them, presumably because the Russians will have lost momentum and, well, of course, Ukraine will be back on the counter-offensive by that time. Well, at the moment, I have to say, holding on to Bakhmut, if events continue as they are, would seem to be a very tall order, at least to me, but that's what the Daily Telegraph article said, and that does suggest to me that that is indeed what the Ukrainians are saying, that perhaps some kind of a counterattack is indeed at least being discussed, or perhaps is in preparation. However, I'm also going to pass on a report from Larry Johnson. This isn't a report, but a piece of analysis from Larry Johnson. And it's important to say that he was a senior officer in the Central Intelligence Agency, the US Central Intelligence Agency, and is somebody who has some ability to do, considerable ability to do analysis. And he makes this point, which is that the next time-lapse video shows the results of capturing Solidar. This is this small town north of Bakhmut. Controlling this city provides Russia with a secure railway line that is being used to provide supplies of food and ammunition to the Wagner Group and other Russian forces on the front line. It also provides the logistics infrastructure for moving wounded soldiers to more secure medical care. Ukraine does not have a comparable logistics system in place to provide the same level of support. Now, if that is correct, and as I said, I have a huge respect for Larry Johnson's analytical powers, which, to be very clear, are certainly greater than mine. Well, if that is correct, then I can't myself see how Ukraine can conduct a counterattack, because it seems to me that the Russians are able to deploy reinforcements and supplies to the battlefronts much faster than Ukraine can do. And I would have thought that, given the importance of this battle, that's exactly what the Russians would do, and that they would counter this counterattack, if there was one, fairly quickly. And by the way, I recall that elsewhere in the article, Larry Johnson has pointed out that there is around 9 Ukrainian brigades that are apparently located in Bakhmut and in the immediate areas around, and that they seem to be in the process of gradually becoming surrounded, or have been surrounded. If you look carefully at the last 9 seconds of a video, and there is a video embedded, there are two videos embedded in his article. Last 3 seconds of the video, you will see that there are at least 9 Ukrainian brigades that are now surrounded and trapped. And to be very clear, these brigades are almost certainly not up to strength. They're probably only a fraction of their present strength. And of course, they'll be short of ammunition and supplies and all of those things, but that's still a considerable body of men. Let's assume that, they're half their force. That would still be around 18 to 20,000 men surrounded. That would explain why this battle is taking such a long time to run its course. In Bakhmut, of course, very heavy losses being experienced in the meantime, principally by Ukraine. Now that's Bakhmut. There's also fighting going on, lots of fighting going on in Avdiivka, further south, perhaps a symbolically even more important town for the Russians than Bakhmut itself. Avdiivka, after all, being very, very close to Donetsk city. It's a suburb, in effect, of Donetsk city. It's the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses around Donetsk city. And events here seem to be moving extraordinarily fast, and I'm finding it very difficult to keep up exactly with what's going on, especially as I confess I haven't the kind of knowledge of the topography that I do, or have acquired over the last few weeks, of the topography in Bakhmut. But it's clear that the Russian objective is to surround Avdiivka, to turn it into another cauldron for the Ukrainian forces there. I've no idea, by the way, how many of those there are. There was some reports a few hours ago that a place called Stepnoye, village near on the northern part of north of Avdiivka, had been captured by the Russians, and this had enabled the Russians to cut a railway line. I'm now hearing reports that Stepnoye is still under Ukrainian control. They're heavily attacked by the Russians, but that the Russians have indeed advanced beyond Stepnoye and have indeed cut the railway line, which would, by the way, suggest that Stepnoye is surrounded and that its fall is only a matter of time, if this is true. And I'm also getting reports that, in fact, I was wrong in thinking that the Russian Air Force has been using 500-kilo bombs to break down Ukrainian defenses in Avdiivka, that in fact the Russians are using much more powerful bombs of 1,500 kilos. Some of these are glide bombs, and they're being used specifically to break down these Ukrainian defenses. And I saw one report which claimed that Russian advances around Avdiivka are sometimes taking place now at over distances within a day of around 7 kilometers, which, given how heavily fortified this entire area is, would be remarkable. However, I want to stress again that though it is clear again that the direction of events in and around Avdiivka is becoming very critical for Ukraine. Indeed, even the Ukrainians are admitting as much. The British Ministry of Defence is conceding the same, even though it's clear that this is the general picture in Avdiivka. I am not in a position to confirm any of the details. I don't know exactly what is happening there. It's clear, as I said, that the Russians are pushing for an encirclement. It seems that's still some way off. And as I said, the exact state of Russian progress and the exact state of the fighting is something which I can't confirm or discuss in detail. There's also been, at the same time, some more reports about fighting near Vuhledar, and the reports suggest significant, or at least perhaps not territorially significant, but some progress, if you like, in and around Vuhledar by the Russian forces. It seems that they've captured more of the key dachas near Vuhledar. So, lots of things going on in the battlefronts of Ukraine. What about this great Ukrainian counter-offensive that we've been hearing so much about? Now, I'm not talking now about the counter-offensive in and around Bakhmut. I'm talking about the much bigger offensive that is undoubtedly being planned for some point in the spring and summer. Now, we've been hearing more news about dribbles of Western supplies starting to reach Ukraine, presumably to support this counteroffensive. There's been confirmation from Norway that the 8 Leopard 2 tanks that they're supplying have now arrived in Ukraine. We've heard reports that some of these French AMX 10 RC wheeled vehicles, some people call them tanks, have also started to arrive in some quantities in Ukraine. Now, on the topic of these wheeled tanks, or so-called tanks, I'm going to say straight away that I've been doing some research, and it's clear to me that they're not tanks at all. And in fact, I'm going to suggest that they're totally unsuitable for battlefield conditions in Ukraine. And I would personally be extremely worried for any Ukrainian soldiers unlucky enough to be operating them. I've seen reports, it seems that they're very light, around 15 tons in terms of their basic weight. They can be provided with reinforced armour, but that increases the weight to 22 tons, which must make it much more difficult for these tanks, or so-called tanks, to operate in muddy conditions and difficult ground conditions, given the fact that they're wheeled vehicles, which it seems to me largely defeats their purpose. But anyway, they in their basic form weigh only 15 tons. That must mean that the armour on these vehicles must be extremely light. They're fairly large, so they're rather obvious targets. But perhaps the most alarming thing about them, and I'm taking this from Wikipedia, it says that the AMX 10 RC is fitted with a 105 millimeter Mecha medium pressure gun mounted in a Giat Industries TK 105 3-man turret. So it's a medium pressure gun of only 105 millimeters. It's almost certainly not going to be especially effective against the frontal armour of Russian tanks. And we go on to read that the cannon fires proprietary ammunition, which I take to mean that it has to use special ammunition. So it's not comparable to the ammunition that the 105 millimeter ammunition that, say, Leopard 1 tanks use. That's a much more high-pressured gun that you would find on the Leopard 1s. This is a medium-pressured gun, so it must use less powerful ammunition. But then the most alarming thing of all, the turret uses a CH-49 electro-hydraulic gun control system. No stabilization system is fitted. So that means that this vehicle cannot fire its gun whilst moving. It has to stop. Now, Russian tanks, contrary to what some people say, at least the Russian tanks that are operating on the battlefields in Ukraine, have full axis stabilization. In other words, they can fire on the move. That is true even of these old T-62s that are apparently being deployed in Kherson region. And of course, they have much more powerful frontal armor than these wheeled so-called tanks have. And of course, they have an immeasurably more powerful gun. Now, this is a reconnaissance vehicle developed by the French military in the 1970s. I suspect it was intended to equip French paratroop and foreign legion units, and it was intended principally for sort of desert patrols in places like North Africa. It's absolutely not the kind of weapon system that I think has any relevance to the war in Ukraine. And again, I must express my deep horror at the idea that the Ukrainians could be palmed off with a vehicle like this. But anyway, moving on. Biggest news is that yesterday the EU decided that they would provide Ukraine with 1 million rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition over a 12-month period. Now, let us try and unpack what that means. And this is my own speculations, but it follows closely from a video that Brian Beletic made recently, in which he said that the Western powers are stripping away all the equipment they have, all the ammunition they have, their 155 millimeter ammunition, or at least they're depleting their remaining stockpiles. And they're sending what they can to Ukraine to support this counteroffensive that Ukraine is going to launch, and that this is really the last shot, because after that, stockpiles will be depleted to the point where that can't be done any longer, and that, as we've seen, industrial production of shells, 155 millimeter shells, is going to take much too long, years in fact, to replenish existing stocks, and there simply won't be enough after these shells have been sent to keep Ukraine equipped. And I think this is right. And I'm going to say also that I think that the United States, for its part, is no longer supplying large quantities of 155 millimeter ammunition. The last announced provision of arms, which has come from the United States, which has just been announced yesterday, is only $350 million. There is references to supplies of shells, 155 millimeter shells. We're not told the quantity, which is indicative that it's perhaps not so very great. But I would also suggest that the total size of the package, $350 million, also points somewhat in the same direction. Now, if we turn to the EU, that would suggest that it's the EU that is supposed to be providing most of the shells. the 155mm shells. And these, of course, are drawn from stockpiles of NATO countries that are members of the EU. It's 1 million shells over 12 months. Now, what does that mean? Now, if these 1 million shells are drawn from stockpiles, which seems logical because we saw from the Financial Times that there isn't much that can be done on the production side to increase the quantities of shells. If it's 1 million shells, then over 12 months, and if these are provided over the entirety of the 12-month period, then we are looking at perhaps shells being supplied sufficient over that 12-month period for Ukraine to fire 2,700 rounds of 155mm ammunition a day. Now, that is less than what Ukraine is currently using. Obviously, American supplies will bring it up. Let's assume that the United States is going to provide another 1 million shells over the same period, which could be true. Well, that might bump it up to something like 6,000 a day. Well, the Russians, as we know, are firing 20,000 rounds of shells a day, and 5,000 to 6,000 is what Ukraine was reduced to a few weeks ago, though now we're told it's fallen to less than that, to around 3,000. Anyway, it doesn't look like a solution if this is what is indeed happening over a 12-month period. There's another possibility that most of these shells are going to be supplied to Ukraine over the next few weeks, and that this 12-month period is a misconception, because maybe the intention is to get these shells to Ukraine as quickly as possible. Now, a few weeks ago, Alexei Reznikov, the Ukrainian defense minister, asked the EU for 250,000 shells a month. Now, 1 million shells over a year is far below that. But let's assume that NATO, or at least the European members of NATO, are going to supply these shells at the rate that Reznikov has asked. That will be 1 million shells, not over 12 months, but over 4 months. That might increase Ukrainian shell use to 8,000 plus rounds a day. Still well below what the Russians are firing, but of course the Ukrainians would also be getting shells over the course of this period from the United States as well. I mean, just see how that might provide Ukraine with enough volume of shells, perhaps, for an offensive of some kind. I'm not saying that it's definite. I'm not saying it's going to work out like that. And of course, there's the risk that Ukraine could find itself using shells at a much higher rate than, 8,000 or 10,000 or whatever it is. It would still be less than what Russia fires on average every day. It might raise the densities over, say, a 3 or 4 month period. But then, what? Because it's clear to me that after this, the EU is out of shells, and the United States probably also. So, we can start to understand the concern that Western officials are expressing that this is essentially Ukraine's last shot. If this spring-summer offensive fails, or fails in its political objectives of forcing the Russians to negotiate on unattractive terms, then Ukraine has lost the war. I don't think there is any other way around it, because the Western powers are not able to sustain shell supply beyond the summer at the kind of rate that Ukraine would need to sustain offensive operations. And with the Russians holding back their main forces, well, they would be in a position to launch an overwhelming attack, and Ukraine would lack the artillery power, the densities in artillery power to stop that. And that may explain why General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has again made pessimistic comments. He's now reported to say again that he doesn't believe that either side will achieve its objectives over the course of this year. He's sceptical that Ukraine will be able to recover all its territory, or so he says, and he's sceptical that the Russians will achieve their political objectives. Now, notice the difference. He's doubting that Ukraine will achieve its military objectives. As a military man, he probably understands that. He doubts that the Russians will achieve their political objectives, but of course he doesn't know. And perhaps is not the proper person to assess what those political objectives are. I think he understands that perfectly well. And I think he's again signalling to anybody who's prepared to listen that he thinks this Ukrainian offensive is going to fail in its purpose of knocking out the Russians and winning the war for the West and for Ukraine. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this complex topic. We have some idea, as I said, of how many shells the EU is going to supply to Ukraine. We don't know how many shells the United States is going to supply, but I'm guessing not so much. And I accept that's a guess. Who's to say? Anyway, let's now go to the other issue which I want to talk about. And the first thing I'm going to say is that already there's been a really bleak comment from Secretary Blinken about the visit by Xi Jinping to Moscow. And it's really extraordinary, quite what he says, but I'm going to take this. This is from Yahoo. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken criticized Chinese President Xi Jinping on Monday for providing what he termed diplomatic cover for Russian President Vladimir Putin this week. And we go on to read that Xi's meeting with Putin in Moscow on Monday, just days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the Russian leader, suggests that Beijing feels no responsibility to hold the Kremlin accountable for the atrocities committed in Ukraine, Blinken said. Blinken discussed the Xi-Putin meeting during a press briefing for the release of the State Department's annual report of human rights around the world. And he's then quoted as saying that the world should not be fooled by any tactical moves by Russia, supported by China or any other country to freeze the war on its own terms. And regarding China's peace proposal, which, as I've said, isn't a peace proposal at all, Blinken said that the US welcomed any plan that advances a just and durable peace, noting that the proposal included elements the US has long supported, like upholding sovereignty and independence of all countries. Long supported, upholding sovereignty and independence of all countries, people in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, Libya. Other places might have something to say about that, but I'm not going to in this program. Anyway, it goes on to say that Blinken went on to say that any plan seeking a ceasefire that did not uphold Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be a stalling tactic at best, or is merely seeking to facilitate an unjust outcome. Calling for a ceasefire that does not include the removal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory would effectively be supporting the ratification of Russian conquest, Blinken said. Now, I mean, I find this all very strange because, as I said, there isn't actually a Chinese peace plan on the table. I mean, the Chinese have set out a position paper, but they have emphasized that peace, that sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected. So I don't quite understand what Blinken's objections to all of this are. And I went on to go on to read Blinken talking about China's human rights record. After all, comments were made in conjunction with the situation with the release by the State Department of its comments about human rights in various countries. It says that, and these are Blinken's words, China continues its abuses, including genocide and crimes against humanity, against Uyghurs, repression of Tibetans, crackdown on basic rights in Hong Kong, and targeting of individuals on the mainland for exercising fundamental freedoms. Well, you know, if he's going to talk like that to the Chinese, then quite frankly, why should anybody take what he says about China's peace proposals especially seriously? And why would he expect that the Chinese would be prepared to carry any water for him in their dealings with the Russians? But anyway, to move on. I've seen some reports, by the way, that have suggested that Blinken has admitted in these comments, or has confirmed in these comments, that the United States pressed the International Criminal Court to issue the arrest warrant against Putin in order to stop Xi Jinping's trip to Russia. I have to say, I've seen nothing to suggest that in any summary of Blinken's words that I have been able to find in the American media. State Department will no doubt provide a transcript, a readout shortly. If it's there, I will come back to it. Whilst I'm on the subject of the International Criminal Court arrest warrant, I just wanted to add one little detail. When I did my analysis of that warrant a few days ago, I said that I thought it was strange that a warrant like this had been issued before civil remedies for the return of children by their parents, by any parents who felt that they'd been removed without their consent, had not been exhausted. And I queried whether doing that, in other words, short-circuiting the civil legal process, might not, in fact, in strict legal terms, jeopardize any war crimes prosecution in the impossible assumption that one were ever brought. And then, sure enough, an article appeared in The Guardian a few days later, talking about a Mariupol resident. He's actually also a former Ukrainian soldier, Yevgen Mezhevi, whose children were taken to Moscow, to Russia, and he got in touch with various Russian NGOs. He traveled to Russia. He brought complaints about the fact that his children had been taken to Russia, to the office of the other Russian official, the same Russian official who's also been indicted. And all this has happened clearly before the arrest warrant by the ICC was issued. And sure enough, he was given his children back and he took them out of Russia. And I understand that he's now back in Kiev with them. And The Guardian published this story, apparently oblivious to the fact that it actually undermines, at least, or so it seems to me, the entire basis upon which the ICC is bringing or is attempting to bring its case against Putin. Anyway, I'm not going to waste more time on this, but as I said, this seems to show that the Russian claims that their actions fall within civil legal norms and that they're applying civil law are true. But anyway, let's get back to Xi Jinping and his visit to Moscow. Now, all this emphasis that I've been reading in the West about Chinese peace plans and Chinese diplomatic initiatives to end the Ukrainian war, it seems to me are a total exercise in pointlessness. They are entirely beside the point, because it's obvious that the meetings that are taking place in Moscow are only touching on the question of Ukraine. Now, we have had confirmation of 2 meetings between Xi Jinping and Putin. There was a first one that took place yesterday, on Monday, which, far from what I can understand, was a one-to-one meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping. There is a Chinese readout. It's not particularly informative, but it seems to have been a rather informal meeting. It's basically a meeting of old friends. And then there was a follow-up meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping in the Grand Kremlin Palace with all the officials present, and that went on for 5 hours. And today, there's further reports that Xi Jinping is meeting, or has had a meeting, with another important Russian official who is Prime Minister Mishustin, the head of the Russian government. So, and apparently this has also been a massive meeting. And it's quite clear that this is not a meeting, this is not a summit meeting about Ukraine. It's a summit meeting about economics, about trade, about military cooperation, undoubtedly, about cooperation in science and technology, about energy cooperation, about all of these things. Ukraine is only a part of this. I will say briefly that, as I said, it seems to me that this is so completely wrong to think of it as being primarily about Ukraine. I do wonder exactly whether Western commentators fully understand the extent of what is happening. Well, some do, perhaps, but they're also putting a rather strange spin on it. And this is from the Financial Times. And it says that Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin talks highlight Russia's role as junior partner to China. And we go on to read that the sanction, and this is a quote from Maria Shagina, a senior research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, that the sanctions have exacerbated the already asymmetrical relationship between Russia and China. It's hard to hide the fact that Russia is now a junior partner. And then we go on to read that a person, this is presumably Shagina, but it's not absolutely clear to me, Anyway, a person says the following: the logic of events dictates that we, who is we? Shagina? The International Institute of Strategic Studies is based in London. Perhaps she's Russian. I don't know. Doesn't say so. But anyway, the logic of events dictates that we become fully a Chinese resource colony. Our servers will be from Huawei. We will be China's major suppliers of everything. They will get gas from power of Siberia. By the end of 2023, the renminbi will be our main trade currency. What I find very odd about all of these things is that this is also, talk about Russia becoming China's junior partner, becoming a resource colony of China's. That this is presumably intended to upset and alarm and dismay the Russians. But how is it different from what the West wanted of the Russians? After all, it's the Western powers, it's Western politicians, American politicians principally, not Chinese politicians, who talk about Russia being a gas station, masquerading as a country, who've in effect been critical of Russian attempts to develop their technology and scientific base, who've to some extent impeded exports of Russian industrial goods. It seems to me that this is a very curious exercise in mirror imaging. And of course, it's not just that the West has in fact essentially wanted Russia to be a natural resources colony of the West. Third energy package that the EU tried to impose on the Russians effectively demanded the breakup of Rosneft and Gazprom and sought to allow direct exploitation of Russian oil and gas fields by Western energy majors, for example. Something which the Chinese, by the way, are not seeking. Well, not only did the West want to convert Russia into effectively a natural resource colony, but of course it actively and intimately involved itself in Russian domestic politics and still seeks to do so. And it's also conducted vitriolic campaigns against Russian political leaders like Putin himself, and it's even threatening to arrest them. So, I can entirely understand why Russian officials like Putin, Mishustin, and others might say, well, we have to be a natural resources colony of someone. The Chinese are ultimately offering us a much better, more stable deal than the West is. The West abuses us, meddles in our affairs, threatens to arrest our leader, extends its military alliance to our borders, ignores our strategic interests, blows up our pipelines. Why should we not instead prefer the deals being offered by Beijing? They treat us with respect. They don't come with all this sanctimonious baggage and lecturing of us that the Western powers do. Surely this is a better and easier and more stable relationship from every point of view than the one which the West offered us. I'm going to add something further, which is that I suspect that the Chinese are indeed minded to seek a more advanced relationship from the Russians than just treating Russia as a natural resources colony. There's an interesting video by Andrei Martyanov in which he discusses how, in terms of some fields of military technology, the Russians are ahead of the Chinese. And of course, he focuses principally on hypersonic weapons. I would add nuclear submarine technology. I've discussed this in previous programs. And of course, I would add that a couple of years ago, Putin himself confirmed that the Russians have actually assisted China in developing its radar early warning systems. And Russia has strong strengths in STEM subjects. It's got a significant scientific and technical base. Of course, it's not anywhere near as big as that of China's, but it exists, and it's strong, and it's certainly stronger than I suspect one would find in most, perhaps all European countries, that I don't pretend to be intimately familiar with all of that. So I can fully undersee why the Chinese might want to tap into that, might provide investment to it, might want to build it up in their own interests. Now, I'm not suggesting this is going to be an equal relationship. China is a much bigger economy, far bigger economy than Russia's is. But the Russians do have things to offer China, natural resources, obviously. As I said, some technology, some military technology, geopolitical weight as well. It's a big country, a powerful country, a country that has friends in many places, in the Middle East, in Africa. By the way, Putin took time off yesterday before Xi Jinping arrived to actually address a summit meeting that's taking place in Moscow, to which various African states have been invited. Anyway, it's an important country for the Chinese to work with. And I would have thought that rather than see Russia fade into some kind of colony, from a Chinese point of view, it actually makes more sense to have Russia as a strong ally rather than a weak one. That seems to be the tactic that the Chinese are in fact conducting. And clearly, this is the key relationship from a Chinese point of view, because Russia does have all of these vital things that China needs: the food, the grain, oil, the gas. Russia is now China's biggest supplier of natural gas. The Power of Siberia 2 pipeline will enhance that even further. It's also now China's biggest supplier of crude oil, and I suspect refined oil products before very long. And of course, lots of other strategic minerals. Apparently, Russia has very large lithium deposits, which are so far unexploited, for the sake of comparison. Anyway, all of this, and of course, it's, as the Chinese also have said, the two economies dovetail. They complement each other. And they complement each other in terms of military power, geopolitical reach. They make a very, very powerful team indeed. Now, of course, it is not just Russia that is converging in this relationship. Iran obviously is on board. Probably beyond a certain point, Turkey will be too. But another important BRICS leader is going to be heading to Beijing before long, and that is Lula da Silva, the new president of Brazil. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about Lula's foreign policy. Many people felt that his election meant that Brazil was going to distance itself from the BRICS. Well, Lula da Silva is going to Beijing, and apparently he's intending to stay there for 5 days. 5 days of intense talks with the Chinese leaders, including, of course, Xi Jinping, but no doubt other leaders as well. I think that people are missing the plot here, talking in these sour terms like Blinken does about China providing diplomatic cover to Russia. Worrying, stressing about a Chinese peace plan over Ukraine, which is, as I said already, nothing more than a position paper up to now. Either misses or refuses to address the big picture, which is that all of these powerful states, China, Russia, Brazil, Iran, many other countries, India before long, I suspect, too, Indonesia as well, quite likely, are now starting to do their business independently of the United States. Obviously, as the biggest, by far the biggest, non-Western economy, China is going to take pole position. But it's not just China, not even just China and Russia, though, as I said, that is the core relationship at the moment. But it is rather the creation of a genuine multipolar world, one which, to my dismay, is being built against the West, as opposed to the West being a part of it, as in my opinion it should be. Anyway, that's the end of today's video. No doubt more from me, well, there will be more from me soon. We'll see what happens to all of these Ukrainian counteroffensives when they materialize, as I'm no doubt they will. We'll see what all this Western military support for Ukraine amounts to. And in the meantime, we should not disregard the enormous consequence of this visit by Xi Jinping to Moscow. Well, thank you. Today, just to remind you again, you can find all our videos on our multiple platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.